just for fun. Let's get things started. So the first thing I want to look at and think about is what we call disposable income. Disposable income. Now, when we put the plate of spaghetti up last class, we've got, in the basic version here, we've got our output market. Households sell resources to generate income, right? Income is Y. So not WY, I'm not asking you a question, WHY, but income is a big capital Y. And what we have at our disposal, since the government collects that tax, is income after tax called disposable income. From there, we choose to save it for consumption tomorrow, or we consume it for consumption today, right? So that's our choice and how we split up our income. So that's where I want to start us off, thinking about that equation. And so we've got a new thing here, Y subscript D, our disposable income is income after tax. So Y minus T. Disposable income is income after tax. So T, big T here, equals the total tax paid. And in this case, it's income tax, by the way, but that's all right. What do I do with it? I either consume it or I save it. So I'm going to partition my money into consumption. This is from our cigarettes consumption, C plus I plus G plus X. I can consume it, or I may decide to save it. And economists like to put a little twist on that savings. We just think of savings today as tomorrow's consumption. So it allows you to consume stuff more tomorrow. I'm either consuming today or I'm consuming tomorrow. So you can kind of think of this as tomorrow's consumption. All right. Now, let me just try to clean that up here. I think, so Y minus T equals C plus S. Disposable income equals consumption plus savings. Or we can think about how we spend our gross income before tax by just throwing that, doing a little math and throwing the T over to the other side. Consumption plus savings plus the amount we spend or give to the government in terms of tax. So C plus S plus T. All right, there's a reason to my madness here. We now want to go back and tie this into our cigarettes. So recall that GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. And now let's take this equation, since income can be thought of as consumption, savings, and taxes. Let's take this Y and substitute it in for this one. All right, so I'm going to take this and shove it into there. So I get C plus S plus T equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. What can we do with the C's? We can cancel them, so that's, we got a C over here and a C over here on both sides of the equal sign, so those cancel out. And this chapter's on investment and savings. Now in our cigarettes, what type of investment am I talking about? What are some things that go into I? Let's try to do that more of a T. What goes into this? Stocks and bonds? No, not in econ class. Personal finance class? Yes. So it's not that that's wrong in different classes. Sean? The capital, good, right. So what types of capital? That's absolutely right. Give me some examples. Tractors. We saw tractors last time. Sewing machine, good. A house. So we did include houses, new construction houses in the investment category as well. All right, so all the purchases that business makes, tractors, sewing machines, all kinds of capital equipment, that's what falls into this investment category. All right, so now what I want to do is kind of rearrange this equation so that the I is left all by itself, all by its lonesome. And so there's a couple different ways to do it. You guys can take a couple steps if you want, but ultimately I want I all by itself. So I'm going to put, if I swing this stuff over here, maybe it's better for me to do it that way. I'll do it 2 steps. So S plus T minus G minus X equals I. Now I want to flip this around, or just kind of put the I here and put this junk over there, just so it kind of reads nicer. Now, as we start to do that, though, what is this and this? What's this? T and a G? T minus G? Same thing as, are they equal to each other? Is that what you're saying? Same thing? Are those two equal to each other? No. In fact, in the United States, what's normally true about
G is bigger than T.
G is bigger than T. So G is government spending, how much money the government is spending on stuff. T is the amount of taxes that they collect. So T minus G has a different name to it that we're going to cover in chapter 13 in a lot of detail, but it's certainly a word that all of you guys know. It's called the government deficit. That's right, not the debt. And we'll talk more about, I'm not even going to spend time talking about the difference between debt and deficit. We'll spend a lot of time doing that. But that's the government deficit. In this case, it's the amount of savings that the government would have. If they collect more taxes than they spend, then there's money left over, right? So it's kind of like saving money. So this is government saving in a sense. All right, so let me do what I wanted to do first. I'll throw the I. So I'm going to put all this stuff, I'm basically just taking the equation and saying investment is equal to savings, which is exactly what I got written here. Now, what savings, where's this coming from? What kind of savings is going on there? Household savings, right. So that came from this equation up here. The households are either consuming savings or paying taxes to the government. So there's private savings. And then we've got plus T minus G, which is government saving. And then I'm going to kind of blow this one up on you. Maybe I'll just kind of do it here. This is minus exports minus imports, minus in the parentheses, right? Because this was net exports.
It would be minus exports plus imports.
Yeah, so then you carry this little sign in, and it's imports and exports. It's actually imports minus exports, which is a little bit strange, but it tells the right story. Watch this. So over here, I'm going to put plus imports minus exports, which just flips that around. And if Americans would be importing more than they're exporting, does that go on? Yes. Yes. If they import more than they export, then this expression is positive. and kind of helps finance some of this investment. The reason that works is that it's actually Chinese money coming into the United States. They are buying our real estate. They are investing in U.S. firms. They are buying government treasury bills. And so when we run a current account deficit, which is the trade deficit, imports are greater than exports. When we do that, we have to pay for that somehow, right? We're actually importing more goods than we're exporting. So in a kind of a debit equal credit type of framework, how do we pay? Well, it turns out the Chinese lend us money. We are borrowing from them for those extra imports that we're doing. This expression's capturing that amount because the difference between imports and exports is the amount we have to eventually borrow from the Chinese to finance our consumption of their products. All right, so this is the equation I left you with on that PowerPoint. We've got sorry, I'm getting a little bit low here, but private savings, and then we've got public savings through the government. All of that is domestic saving, by the way, though, right? Because we're talking about the U.S. government spending and the U.S. government taxes, and then we're talking about the American public. So all of this is within our nation going on, this part of the equation. And then this last chunk is foreign savings. And so what we're left with is that our investment in capital, machines, buildings, new construction homes, all of that gets funded by these three pieces at the macro level. Okay, questions or comments there? You guys feel free to stand up in the back if you're, I'll try to word it through. You guys get all this? All right. So, all right. So we're going to go back to the market. I think I'm going to come over here today for a little bit of action anyway. So last time I left you with this picture of the loanable funds market. And in the loanable funds market, we had people who wanted to save money, which now our SLF curve is the supply of loanable funds. That's our households that are choosing to save some of their money. The higher the real interest rate, the more of that they'll do, right? The real interest rate, we had a shortcut that we did last time. It was approximately equal to the nominal interest rate minus inflation. So once again, anytime we hear the word real, it's an inflation-adjusted number of some sort. The demand for loanable funds comes from borrowers. These are mostly our firms that are looking to buy tractors and machines. But it can also be the government if they are needing to borrow funds because they're not collecting enough in taxes. So that equation being flipped around that we just derived, where G is bigger than T, means that the government is a player in the loanable funds market. And we're going to look at the impact of that here in a little while. So the interaction of savers and borrowers gives us a quantity of loanable funds exchanged at some real interest rate. There's our equilibrium condition. All right, so let's write some of that out here. Demand for loanable funds, the DLF curve. shows how businesses and or government desire more funds. They want to increase investment when it costs less to do so. A decrease in R. So what we're justifying is why does it look the way it does? Why is it downward sloping? Sometimes it seems like a no-brainer. If interest rates are low, I'm going to borrow more money, right? That's all it's saying. All right, and remember that the emphasis here is on businesses, although in the United States the government ends up being a pretty big player as well. But for the most part, it's businesses. And so this shows this for a given level of expected profits. Expected profit. So there's our assumption on what drives the market. Get my cameraman in action here. Going up. There we go. Okay. All right. Our supply of loanable funds. The SLF curve, shows us our saving behavior, and the lower the real interest rate, R, the lower R is, the lower is the opportunity cost. Oops. The lower is the opportunity cost of consumption. Now, I want to think about that one after we get it written down here. So the lower is the opportunity cost of consumption, which means we save less today. Given disposable income, wealth, and expected future income. All right. So that just kind of cues us up for what the market's going to do and how it's going to respond. And the fun comes in with the shifters. Now, what is the key word up there that tells you what's going to shift those curves? There's one word up there that is the thing that lets you know there's going to be some shifting going on. What word is it? Which one? I think I heard it. Given. Yes, that's right. So given is the things we hold constant when we draw that relationship in the first place. So the given part is, okay, I'm thinking about whether I should buy a new tractor or something. I'm going to hold constant my expected profits. Why? Because if I all of a sudden get hit with new profit expectations because there's some new law passed and agriculture looks good and I'm a farmer And so now I raise my expectation level of profits that I think the soybean and the corn crop's going to be bumper. What might I want to do in terms of my tractor inventory? Go buy some more, right? So I'm going to respond to that. So I'm holding that constant because that'll end up shifting the curve if it changes. All right, so these are important variables that follow the word given that end up being our shifters. So let's just cut to the chase here. The supply shifters, there's only a 1 with this particular one, and that is expected profits. Whoops, I can't use that shorthand for this class. Have to be inflation. Expected profit. An increase in expected profit leads to an increase in the supply loanable funds, which means a shift to the right. What usually throws people on this shifter business is getting too fixated on this equilibrium result. Don't forget that even if we're looking at a graph like this, that there is a whole bunch of interest rates in here. There's one there, there, and then there's a whole infinite number or more in between. And so what this schedule of numbers, if we had our schedule goggles on, remember it would probably be a list of R and the LFs associated with each R. And we go boom, 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 boom. That's what this graph is showing. And so at this interest rate, I used to want to do let's put a number on here. At 5% interest, I used to want to borrow this much money, what am I doing, savings? No, I'm doing demand. I used to want to borrow this much money because I'm a business buying a tractor. Now I want to borrow this much. At this interest rate, I used to want to do this much, now I want to do this much. At this interest rate, I used to want to do this much. Now that I have higher expected profits, I want to do this much. At this interest rate, I used to want to borrow this much. Now that I expect more profits, I want to borrow this much. So at all interest rates, this thing moves off to the right, and we have a shift in the demand for loanable funds, which is where I screwed up there. That needs to be a D, doesn't it? I knew there was something wrong. All right, so to start to get comfortable with those shifts, I'm going to start to ditch little reminders to you of shift to the right. You're just going to have to start remembering up arrow means shift to the right. That's the process that's going on each time. So make sure you change this to a D, demand for loanable fund shifters. All right, questions on the profit motive there in the demand curve for loanable funds? All right, now SLF shifters. What's going to shift the supply around? Again, we go to our definition, and the first thing following the given part is disposable income. So disposable income, which we'll use the big Y subscript D, disposable income. An increase in disposable income leads to what with the savings supply curve? If you have more disposable income, what happens here? Left or right? Left? Right? I kind of heard them hearing kind of mixed signals here. So I have more money to spend, right or left? Right. Correct. Right. All right. So when I have more money, when I have more disposable income, I guess my question is, aren't I going to consume more? Don't Americans tend to just spend that extra money when they get more money in their paycheck? Yeah, they tend to do that too, right? But if you remember that equation, what was it again? Look at that equation. YD equals C plus S. So we're going to do more of both. Remember when we talked about putting our money, like 90% of it towards pizza and $10 in the bank? So if we have more of it, we'll probably do more of both. So both those things would tend to be normal goods. We're going to consume more today, and we're going to attempt to consume more tomorrow. So an increase in disposable income leads to an increase in the supply of loanable funds. All right, number 2. I guess I'll put number 2 in here. Number 2. Our wealth. What was wealth again? We did that last time with our buckets. What was the difference between our wealth and our income? Because here we're talking about income, here we're talking about wealth. Assets is part of it. What's the other part? That is part of the equation. What is it? Savings, part of our assets, yep. What's the other part we need to subtract, though? Our debt, right? So we can get kind of non-accounting about it and think about what we own minus what we owe, if we want to take the non-accountant approach to this. So otherwise, our assets minus our liabilities. Is this a stock or flow variable? Stock or flow? Oh, some of you are thinking, what the heck is a stock variable again? What's a flow variable? So let's start there. What's the difference between a stock and a flow variable? I think I have my extra credit pen somewhere in here. Stock variable, flow variable, what's the diff? Stock, now you're relating it to one of our concepts, was stock was capital. I'll give you a hint. If I told you I make $146,000, would you think I'm rich? If I make $146,000, would you say I'm rich?
I'd say you have a good income.
Why do you say I have a good income? And what'd you say, Luke?
If it was a year.
If it was a year. What if I said I made $146,000 over 10 years? Am I rich or poor? Still better than me. Probably relatively poor, like poverty level poor, right? If you're making $14,600 a year on average, you're kind of in the lower income percentages here for the United States anyway. You'd be pretty rich if you were in some of the parts of Africa, but you'd be pretty poor, relatively speaking, in the United States. So when I say the word income, what other information do you need for it to have meaning to you? If I say I make $146,000, I say that's meaningless until I do what? Until I put a time element on it, right? So flow variables happen over a period of time. So that is our spigot in our bucket theory. If we think about the difference between stock variables and flow variables, the flow is what's going on over a period of time. A stock variable has meaning at a point in time. So you brought up the capital analogy. We have a certain amount of machines. If we froze time right now, in theory we could take an inventory of how many tractors, how many buildings, how many computers, how many sewing machines, all of that, and we could see what the bucket level is. at a point in time. How does the bucket level change? Well, over time, I buy more sewing machines. There's investment over this year of new purchases where I gave up some of my satisfaction today in terms of Twinkies, and I bought a tractor, right? And so my capital bucket went up. Some sewing machines wore out, so depreciation is a flow variable. The net effect of the inflow and the outflow gives you the change in the stock variable. Back to my question. Wealth, stock or flow? Somebody's pretty wealthy and they have $1 million net worth or $1 million worth of wealth. Does that have meaning to you right now? Yes. What does it mean to you right now? He's got a million. He or she's got $1 million worth of assets that are in excess of any liabilities. They might have $10 million worth of assets and $9 million worth of debt, giving you $1 million net worth. Or you could have $1 million worth of assets and no debt. It's a bit of an aside, but what would you rather have? If you were a millionaire, what would you rather have? $1 million worth of assets and no debt, or $10 million of assets and $9 million of debt? Same number at the end of the day, $1 million. You're a millionaire. We're talking about two different types of millionaires.
No interest in debt.
Which one would you rather be? Debt-free?
Debt-free.
All right, so there's a little more risk with this. Right? There's a little more risk. If the market takes a 10% kerplunk and your $10 million of an assets become worth $9 million, is that possible that there could be 10% variability in the market potentially? Yeah. Go back to 2008. It was even more variability than that. And so all of a sudden you've got $9 million of assets because of the little kerplunk, and you still have $9 million of debt. You went from becoming a millionaire to a zero-millionaire real quick, right? Zero in there. I'm gonna have to. That's got something to it. It didn't quite roll off the tongue well there, but I think I might be onto something. A zero in air. A zero in air? I might have to check into that. I might have just invented a new cool word that's very relevant for personal finance. All right, so let's see what happens here with the wealth effect. So, if there's an increase in wealth, if you have an increase in wealth, will you tend to save more or less? Remember, we're on the shifter list here. If you have an increase in wealth, would you tend to increase your savings or decrease your savings? Now you're like, Russ, I thought wealth was savings. What the heck's going on? Is saving YD equals C plus S flow variable or stock variable? Flow, I'm hurting your brain, aren't I? Flow variable, right? I earn income $146,000 this year, and I choose to consume a certain amount, let's say 120, and I save 16, right? That savings is a flow. What happens to my wealth when I do this? Does it go up or down? It goes up. It's an inflow into the bucket. So my savings is a flow into my wealth bucket. If I hold all things constant, and there's an asset appreciation, and my wealth goes up, will that induce me to save more money or save less money?
I think I'd save more money. Or not. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Sometimes I
If-
feel like I have more money now.
If my wealth goes up, because I'm trying to analyze what happens to savings, which is a flow concept, stock concept, flow concept. If my wealth goes up, maybe due to asset appreciation, so my $10 million worth of real estate went up to $11 million worth of real estate, or whatever, okay? All your assets. Will that induce me to save more today or less today if my wealth goes up? less, it turns out. I know that's a little bit counterintuitive, but the idea here is if you have a target savings amount, the reason why you're savings, why you are saving money is to build up wealth. Well, if you get an automatic bump up in wealth, then maybe you can hold off a little bit of savings today, and maybe you'll drop this down from 16 to, we could probably do 10 this year. Look at how much our assets have gone up already. My house value is climbing. So now let's consume 126. Some Twinkies, beer, and chicken wings, 6,000 worth of Twinkies, beer, and chicken wings sounds a little more fun to me now, right? The trade-offs of future consumption versus current consumption, we've kind of distorted that through our wealth. All right, so I wanted to take a little time with that one because that is the financial crisis in America. That is a lot of what happened in the United States, is that households over that, let's go back 10 to 20 years prior to 2008 when the financial crisis hit, households started to become deceived a bit. How many of your parents' homes went up in price quite a bit and they felt pretty comfortable with life because their house climbed from $150,000 to $200,000 from 2000 to 2008? See a few hands. I know you don't always talk about that with your parents, but that's what happened. So we had asset appreciation. People are thinking, oh, my nest egg is covered. I've got my house and it's worth $300,000 and I only owe $200 on it. I've got $100,000 in the bank, right? That caused them to make different decisions today on how much they should tuck away. And so American savings has gone down and down and down over time, at least in part. Of course, there's lots of cultural influences on TV, all those ads, that all the gleamy, glossy stuff that we want to buy. But one factor is this wealth effect. We started to kind of deceive ourselves that we were becoming wealthier when really it was a little bit of smoke and mirrors, because those prices were in an asset bubble going up, and boop, the bubble pops, it comes down, reality hits. That maybe we didn't save as much as we should have or could have or would have had we had an understanding of that. Okay, questions or comments there?
So then the wealth of our nation went up over a certain period of time. So we were doing more consumption, we were importing a lot, we were exporting, so our SLF went down.
Yes, that's right. Yep. So our own savings, and then once we bring the rest of the world into it, China didn't do the same thing. They ended up funding our consumption.
That's chapter 1.
Yeah, and that's where we'll get into more of that with some future stuff. But yeah, that's the concept here. I'm thinking about the global capital flows. But for this chapter, we just kind of want to hone in on what goes on here with us in terms of shifting our savings behavior. All right, so that's the wealth effect. Oh, I wanted to write that down a little bit. Not leave you completely hanging. So, increase in wealth, decrease in savings, an increase in wealth through inflation puts less pressure on saving money from each paycheck. So example, an increased inflation causes house prices to go up. Causes an increase in house prices, leads to an increase in home equity. That's how much money or value you have in your house. Causes an increase in home equity, making you think that you've saved up enough money for retirement. And that leads you to decrease saving today. And I'm going to put saving without the plural on there. And saving being our S from our flow variable. And I guess one thing you might want to add in that we talked about is that the wealth again maybe I should use the green would be appropriate for wealth. Our wealth is the stock variable, and our savings is the flow. Okay. Our last one on this list is expected future income. An increase in expected income, our future income, what does that do to your savings today? Do you tend to save more today? A lot of you guys, how many of you are expecting more income in the future than you are currently making today?
Hope so.
I hopefully see a whole bunch of hands here, right? And so how's your saving behavior today? Are you guys tucking away lots of dollars? No, right? So when you expect higher income in the future, like, I'll worry about that tomorrow. I'll worry about that tomorrow. There's a danger to this, by the way, because then you get to be my age, and you're like, I'll worry about tomorrow. I'm an optimist, so I'm always thinking that tomorrow's income is going to be higher than today's. And so you sometimes get into a behavioral trap that maybe tomorrow never quite comes, and the next day always looks rosier. You might just run yourself into some problems. So be careful of that. But an increase in expected income leads to a decrease in savings today. A shift to the left of the savings supply curve. All right. So the next thing I want to do is, any questions on that one? I think I'll put it up here. I want to bring the government into the picture to make some predictions about the impact of deficits. Where did I put that plaque? There it is. So let's call this the effects of a government deficit in the loanable funds market. So I want you to start off with home base here. And now in home base, I want to imagine a fairy tale place where the government has a balanced budget. I know, it's kind
Hang
of...
on. I don't know if I have that kind of imagination.
Okay, so government runs a balanced budget. Or if you want, we can even think of no government, but that's a little harder. That might be just as hard than as thinking about a balanced budget. So again, private citizens of firms and households and the rest of the world, by the way, figure out that they can make a deal in borrowing and lending at this interest rate and these loanable funds. So let's just say that this interest rate, we'll just keep with our 5% here. All right, so what happens if the government now runs a deficit? What happens? Something to demand or something to supply? Is there more loanable funds, or is somebody demanding loanable funds? They're demanding loanable funds, right? They need to borrow funds if G is greater than T. So if we've got a bunch of spending that's a lot bigger than our tax collections, we need to pay for that stuff still, and so we need to borrow. So the government issues out what's known as T-bills and other short-term treasuries to the market. So when they do that, they are an extra player in the market, and the demand for loanable funds shifts out. Now what I want to do is add in the way the textbook does it. I kind of like it this way. We're making a distinction between the private demand for loanable funds. So just sneak in a little P over here. So this is, the P stands for private sector. Private demand for loanable funds. And the demand for loanable funds now has both government and private sector in it. Does that make sense? What happened to interest rates? I just snuck that in on you, right? Interest rates go up. So the government and the private sector are essentially competing for funds. And interest rates tend to go up. So maybe they go up to 6%. More funds are being exchanged. So the new loanable funds amount goes out to LF2, which sounds like, oh, well, there's more activity going on in the United States, right? The sum of the two's got to equal each other out. But that's not the case. Because as interest rates go up, what are businesses deciding to do? Are they borrowing more money for more tractors or less? Less, but this is going up. But if we follow the private demand for loanable funds, we see their behavior all by themselves. Because as interest rates go up, the picture that we got over there with that graph, they borrow less. So the private demand for loanable funds, let's call it PLF, sits over here. Let's call it PLF2, because that's the private demand for loanable funds. This is the actual amount of funds being traded. And this represents government borrowing. The difference between these two is the deficit. That money's being allocated to whatever the government is spending their money on, which is what we'll spend a lot of time later on going over. What are they spending their money on? And so motion here of the private sector reducing their activities is called crowding out. Crowding out. The private sector gets crowded out. It's like there's another player in the game and there's only a fixed amount of funds to be traded. That drives up interest rates and reduces private investment. That phenomenon is called crowding out. All right, we'll pick up there on Monday.